Okay, welcome to week 2 of the Design Studio. What we'll do today is I'll just quickly take you through some examples of what we expect in the program analysis and the site analysis. And I will post this recording to the internet as I did with the last recording, so that you can actually go back and have a look to what it's about. So what I'll do today is not only show you good ones, but I'll also go through I'll also go through some that have problems, and so you know the kind of issues that are involved with doing this kind of analysis. Okay, so we'll start with the program analysis. So this is an example of what I'm talking about. So what you can see here is you can see that this student has split it up into all the different sizes which they've gotten from their functional brief. This example here is from a third year. It's from Design Studio 3.1 from 2016, and what's good about it is that you can see it in 3 dimensions and you can see all the different sizes with it. What's not good about it is actually all the heights of the spaces are exactly the same. So from the director's office, which would be just a normal office height, through to the main reference library, this was a library program, the heights are all considered the same. So what we want you guys to do is to actually consider what heights these things should be. I've actually specified what heights they should be also in the brief, so you have an indication there. So that needs to be reflected here. The other thing that I've asked for with this exercise is that it is drawn to scale, drawn and printed to scale is most importantly. It's the most important thing. So what we want to do is we want to run a scale rule over it. So you tell us what the scale is, we'll run the scale rule over it, and then we'll be able to see what you've done, to see how high you've drawn it, to see how wide you've drawn it, and so on and so forth. Okay, as a point of communications, scale is very important. The problem with this particular example is that it's drawn in perspective. Now, the trouble with perspective is that the distances, the lengths and the widths the scale of the length and the width for things closer and things further away are not the same, which means we can't scale off it. Okay, similarly the height. So in perspective, this height here is going to be larger than this height here, even though they're meant to be drawn the same. So the problem there is really to draw something which we can scale off. Perspectives is not something you can do. So this example is much better because this looks like it is an axonometric. So an axonometric is really just a plan that is turned by 30 degrees, 60 degrees, or 45 degrees, and then the height projected up from that. But I'm sure you guys know all of that as well. This is an example of where there are linkages starting to be made. So basically, you can see that from this this green box here, you can go into this spot, and then from this spot you can go into these spots here, and then this this spot here is also linked to the bathrooms. But if you follow the logic of this diagram, essentially you can't get into it in any way. There's not actually any entry shown in any place. Yeah, so basically you can't get into it. And the other thing is to get to the function room. Let's say reception and management. Let's imagine that the entry is here. We shouldn't need to imagine. You guys need to tell us. Okay, so it's a very straightforward and obvious thing. It's better that you have the information there and then we can fix it up later, rather than not have the information there. So go over rather than under, and then we'll work out how best to do it. It may already be perfect by the time you bring it to us. So let's imagine the entry is there, because it says reception. So what this means is that if you want to get to the chamber music jazz venue, you actually have to go through the main reference library, because there's a line there, and then through to the public access collection library, and then through to the bathrooms, the toilets, and then through to the function room, and then from there to get to the chamber music jazz venue. Now, a music venue is generally something that has performances maybe at night. So, whereas a library is something that's generally open during the day, at least the bits where the books are. So what this diagram is telling me is to get to the jazz venue at night, you have to go through the library, which is then a security issue, isn't it? Or a staffing issue, because you'd have to have your library staff at the library until the jazz performance finished. Okay, so this is the way that we'll be reading it. So when you draw your boxes, make sure you have an entry into one box from the street. So you can just have an arrow going into one box, and at the end of the arrow you can say street, and then move on from there. So an entry and an exit. Now this one is actually a case study of an existing building, but this one you can see is quite different. It's actually scaled. And so what we can then do is we can then measure this to check to see that what that dimension is. We can check the height. You see the heights of these spaces here are bigger than the heights of these spaces here. And you can also see it's color coded. So you can see that the green areas are actually the living areas. The dark gray areas are the service areas. And then the light gray areas are the admin areas, and then the linkages are done with this green line over here. Okay, so this is a much clearer diagram because we can see what the relationships are, and then we can actually scale off to see what all the spaces are. In plan as well to color code it. So you might start a plan might be an easier way to deal with the relationships between the spaces, and then the boxes, the EXO or ISO boxes, may be a good way to show us what the volumes look like. This is another one here. So this one you can see that it is again in axonometric, and it's got a scale of 1 to 250. With scales, remember to make them Australian standard scales. All right, so I'll just quickly tell you what an Australian standard scale is. It's basically 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 1 to 20, 1 to 25, 1 to 50, 1 to 100, and multiples of that. So 1 to 100, 1 to 200, 1 to 250, 1 to 500, 1 to 1,000. And then we go on from there. Okay, so when you guys are deciding on scales, make it a scale that you can find on your Australian Standard scale ruler. Okay, and your scale ruler will say Australian Standard on it. Okay, it doesn't mean that other scales are not correct. It's just scales that we don't use, and we are unlikely to have a scale rule that will fit that. So, for example, 1 to 300 and 1 to 400 are not Australian Standard scales. So if you make them those scales, we can't scale them. Yeah, we can't scale them because our scale rules don't have those scales. I mean, we can work it out if we tried hard enough, but the requirement is really the convention is for you guys to use standard scales. Okay, 1 to 600, 1 to 700, 1 to 800, 1 to 900, they're not scales either. Okay, we clear on that? Very good. 1 to 250 is a standard scale. So really it's a balance, because what you want to do is to get the biggest drawing possible on the piece of paper, so it's legible, right? So it's easy to read, but you still want it to be a proper scale. So sometimes you may have to go to the next scale down, just to get the thing on the paper. Maybe a bit smaller than the size of the paper, but that's just one of the things we have to live with. The other thing that this student has done is that they've actually drawn in the outside areas here, and you see the outside areas here, this private staff courtyard here. Is that clear enough? Can you see what's going on? You can't see, Kane? Hanan is nodding yes. So maybe use this as an introduction, and then we can look at the recording and the slides later. But this one here is just, it doesn't have any height, and that's because it's an outside space. Okay, so all of those things need to go in as well. This student has actually done a height analysis, which is not really necessary, but it makes it very clear to see the different heights of the different things that they're considering. Then here you have you actually have the relationship diagram. So this is really about a series of blobs. This is not really about measurable areas. We don't expect the area of this circle. We don't expect to have to figure out the area of this circle, but we want to see that basically there's something going into this appliance bay, and then there's something coming into this space, and then something going out. And then from there, you've got things that feed into that space. Yeah. So this one you can see here that it's got this pathway here. So it doesn't also have an entry. So really, it should have an entry here because people should come into this space here, and then from there they can go into all the different spaces. And so this one has a staff car parking space here. So obviously, you can only get to the staff car parking from the private courtyard, but both this lounge and this kitchen feed into the private courtyard. So you can start to see how the thing will work when you're in it in terms of the relationships. And then the students started to lay the thing out in 3D. So this is an extra step that this student has taken, which really helps. And then they've actually got these kind of walls in here to split up all the different spaces based on how they're supposed to be used. So you can see public parking here coming through this space here. So the public come through here. This was an ambulance station, so the ambulances come through here, and then there's all these other relationships here. Yeah. So so this is a really good example of that kind of diagram. Now this one is a bit more complicated. This project here was what we ran for 2.2 last year, which was an ambulance station. But these examples here come from 3.1, which is what you'll be doing next semester. So 3.1, the program for 3.1 will be more complicated than 2.2, meaning that the building type will have more functions in it and different relationships between it. And it's generally an urban type project. So you can see this one is in the center of Canberra. So this is a good thing to show you guys, because it's showing you what a good version of what's going to happen next semester is, so you can start working towards that. So this one is really a kind of combined drawing here, and you can see it's a combination of the roads, the existing buildings, and the lake. Now it's when it was printed out and put on the wall, it was quite a beautiful thing. But what we need to think about is what happens when we turn materials into digital form. So what you can see here is that the Lake Burley Griffin grey and the roads and car parks grey are really similar, are getting really similar, right? And what she's doing here, what the student is doing here, is the busy roads are darker grey, and the less busy roads are actually a lighter grey. So you can see this one is lighter grey than this. So what she's saying is that there's a lot more traffic around this space here. But at places, the greys of the roads are also starting to become like the greys of the lake. So architects generally like to have these very subtle differences, but those subtle differences must work in the media in which you are presenting it. So for you guys, because you're handing it in on paper as well as a PDF, it needs to be able to be read as a PDF. If it ends up being too subtle, things start to merge in terms of color, in terms of tone, then you're not actually being successful in getting the information across. You can see here, this one is actually about all the different kinds of building types around the site. Again, a really beautiful drawing, especially since it tells you what the site is, where the site is, which is the yellow one. But a lot of these greys are, the community and the residential are very similar in tone. Yeah, so you'd want to be beefing up the contrast a bit. Working in 3D is good, and this one, of course, you have to remember is in the middle of Canberra, so you have to so there's a lot of buildings in Canberra, so you guys don't have the same level of structures, but it's always good to know what kind of built structures are around the place. Height analysis, visually and also color coded. This one actually is good because this is actually talking about solar access, which you're asked to do, and it actually has a indicative box there, so you can start to see the shadows. But note that there's two suns here. So there's the winter sun, which is lower, and then there's the summer sun, which is this other one. And so the shadows here are only for the summer sun. So what you want to do is to be able to represent the different kinds of shadows there. This one talks about topography, so you can see that they've color-coded it with darker being higher and lighter being lower, so the site goes down this way. You guys don't have a topographical map yet, so you have to find other ways of doing it. Spot levels are always good. So what Melanie was suggesting before to me was a good idea to choose a 0 point from which you can do pluses and minuses. Yeah, and then you can use maybe 1 plus for a shallow slope, and 2 pluses for steeper, and 3 pluses for really quite steep. Or you can use arrows, and then you can do different things with the arrows to show different types of slopes. So fatter arrows for steeper slopes, and skinnier arrows for shallower slopes, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so this one actually talks about constraints of which we don't have a lot of. I'm sorry, let's go back here. This one also has the vegetation on it, as well as these little arrows here, which are probably quite unclear, actually show where the water goes. So that's actually also following the slope. This is another student in that design studio. So it's all about clarity. So in this one, it very clearly shows where the site is within the context of the different kinds of buildings in the city. This one actually shows the main roads and the secondary roads, and you can tell by the thickness. This students actually use the thickness of the roads to represent how important it is. So the skinnier ones are less important. Yeah, and so what these kinds of drawings do is that they abstract, or they isolate out certain types of information so that you can see it clearly. Yeah, so that's why we've given you a list, and that's why we want you to pull each of those things out. For sure, you can put it all in the one drawing, but then it doesn't become very clear. It's all mixed up together. So what's important with things, with drawings like this, is really the spaces in between the colored blobs, so that, as well as the big blob, so that you can actually ascertain a pattern without getting confused by all this other information. Same thing here. Once you take all the buildings out of the road system, then it becomes a really clear drawing. So this kind of map we're quite used to because of GPSs and digital maps and Google Maps and what have you. And you can tell the difference between putting it on the map function, putting Google Maps on the map function, and putting Google Maps on the satellite function. Once you're on the satellite function, that's really too much information. So what maps do is to isolate out certain information in a graphic form. Same thing again here with the existing vegetation. So that's clearly shown. They've actually got the buildings and the roads here, but it's shown in a very sort of restrained way. So you know where you are, but it doesn't distract you from the main information, which is the existing vegetation. Sun path and shadows. So this one actually only looks at the sun path at one time of the day. Sorry, one time of the year. The problem with this is it doesn't actually tell us whether it's summer or winter, and And of course, while we presume that north is supposed to be up, this kind of line doesn't tell us where it starts and where it ends. Now, presumably it starts here and it ends here, but really just putting an arrowhead on the end here would make it much clearer. So this is all about being explicit. All right, let's learn to be completely crude and explicit before we try to make it into beautiful, subtle things. Yeah, because first of all, we got to get the information across before we start making it beautiful in graphic terms. This one is a good diagram because it shows you where the site is and how far away everything is in terms of walking radiuses. Or in terms of as the crow fly radiuses rather, because if you walk between everything, it'll take longer. But there's no need for this line to be this kind of furry line like this. Okay, that's purely graphic. Looks nice. Okay, that's a matter of taste, not to my taste. But I'm not going to mark it down because it's not to my taste. I'm going to mark it down with this one. I'm going to mark it down because it's not clear where the wind is coming from and where it's going to. Is it going this way? Is that what it's trying to suggest? Is summer going this way? So is this the arrowhead or is this the arrowhead? Not clear, right? So whatever you do, it's got to be explicitly clear in showing us what's actually going on. So arrows are really, and lines. Lines with arrowheads are really good for showing direction. This is an example from last year's 2.2. Which is a diagram of the road system. Again, you can see the hierarchy of roads based on the thickness of the lines. This one is pretty clear because really where you've got bigger roads, you've got more lanes. Where you've got more lanes, you've got wider roads. Where you've got wider roads, essentially you've got more color. Okay, so this is an example where the actual urban structure itself is just doing its hierarchy for you. In the city, it's a bit harder because you've got all these road reserves. You've got all these road reserves, but for example, there's big road reserves in here which might not be as busy as this one. They might be the same size but not as busy. So you see, this is what they're trying to do here. It's the same width, but it's a kind of lighter green. Okay, so that is starting to work, but that's just something to keep in mind. For you guys, I think it's fairly clear. We've got fairly explicit major and minor roads in the site. This one is looking at tree density. So basically, the darker the colors, the more dense the flora is, or the trees and plants are, and the lighter it is, the less dense it is. Right. What this doesn't quite tell us is where the grass is. So I would want to be seeing things like grass as well, and then where it's not grass, like paved areas, I just leave that white, so you can see that something is missing. This is a very interesting drawing here because what this is shadow diagrams at 10 and 2 in summer and in winter. So you can see with this one here, you can see that there's dark green shadows for a certain time of the day and light green shadows for a different time of the day. So light green would be morning and dark green would be afternoon and in summer. So you can see that the shadows are quite short in summer because the sun is higher. With this one, you can see that the shadows are much longer, and I've left out the label, but this one actually says sun in winter. So they've worked out the shadows on the buildings, so we can see what the effect is of the sun on the existing buildings in the site. And of course, this then applies to our own site in due course, because what we design we'll have certain ambitions for it. So if we want a sunny room, we have to design the layout, the plan to accommodate that sunny room. If we want views, we'll have to have the plan working towards those views. And sometimes those things may counter each other. So you might want a view, but you may not be able to have a sunny room. So how do you then make it a sunny room? Or you want a view, but it's also facing west, and you've got terrible glare coming in from the west in the late afternoon. So how do you deal with that in this design sense? Yeah. So obviously you can't move the sun, you can't move your view, but you can design things to accommodate both the view and the sun. And this is all stuff that you're doing in sustainable environmental technologies, or techniques rather. So you'd want to be bringing your knowledge of that to the design studio as well. And then this is just a drawing just to show what happens when you bring everything together. Yeah, so you've got the existing buildings, you've got the shadows in winter, you've got the greenery, you've got the existing roads, what have you, and then you've got the actual site itself there. My problem with this is that what's nice about this is all the colors are very complementary and coordinated, but the site requires too much imagination for me to figure out where it is. Of course, I know where it is because I set the damn thing, right? But if this, you got to imagine that someone who doesn't know the site or doesn't know the project is seeing it for the first time, it needs to communicate to them. And of course, there will be people like this, because every one of our assignments will be moderated by an external person. Just so we get outside input to make sure that all our grades are set at the right level, and our grades have parity with across the different tute groups. So you got to think about your presentations in terms of showing it to someone who's never seen it before, yeah, or doesn't know very much about it. So how do you best communicate it to them so that they can get the meaning of your drawing? More examples of different bits and pieces. This one is what's called a figure ground, which is the buildings in black and everything else not. This one's not actually technically correct, because the gray should be white. So figure grounds are generally structures and no structures. So for this one, I would have the site in there, but certainly I wouldn't have the gray, just the black. With this one, it's a smaller view of the roads and pathways. So what's good here is that everything is color coded. So main road is black, streets are dark gray, driveways are medium gray, pathways are light gray, and so on and so forth. But you can see again, for you guys, you see I'm seeing a lot more than what you see, but quite often it needs to be able to read at this kind of level here. So if this is really only 3 versions of gray, whereas there's 6 in what I can see on the screen. So this is a good demonstration as to the problems with making things too subtle and having really crude projection devices. You can't tell what projection device you're going to have, so you have to be ready to have it show clearly on the worst kind of projection device. This one, again, I'm seeing a really beautiful thing on the left here, but you can't really see crap on it because, well, you can see the splodges of green, which are the trees. But this is just something to keep in mind, that we don't always have control over how our things are looked at. With the accreditation process, because our course is accredited by the Accreditation Council of Australia, Architects Accreditation Council of Australia, and we have to send them all this stuff so they can review it before they come to UC. We don't know if their projector is going to be any better than this. So if they project it up and they'll just say, gee, these students are useless, you know, this is crap work. So what we need to do is to make sure that that we give them instructions as to how they're supposed to look at it, or we make sure that it's a really robust kind of presentation so that this can be seen. This image here on the right is interesting because it actually shows all the crossovers, which are in this red color here. So you get an idea as to where the separations of the roads are. Oh dear. This one's about wind. So this is a wind rose, and talks about where the wind comes from. With this one, where the wind comes from in winter and where the wind comes from in summer. And then this is the average over the year over the site for this particular site. So one thing with that, you'll be getting a lot of this stuff off the internet, which is absolutely fine. There's no problem with doing research on the internet, but what you need to look out for is you need to get your information from reliable sources. Okay, from reliable sources. So it's fine to, as a starting point, to say my dad says the wind always comes from this direction in a certain time of the year, but you need to verify that by an authoritative source. So Bureau of Meteorology, some sort of government source, someone who's doing research into wind direction in the ACT region, so on and so forth. Okay. If it's some guy who's complaining about how at his house, he hates the way the winter wind screams through his house from the southeast, that's all fine and well, but we don't know what the conditions are. He may live next to two high-rises which are turning the wind completely around and blowing it into his house. So this is why it's really important to go back to good sources on the internet to find out information. Any questions? Okay, so let's break up into groups let's break up into groups to actually before we break up. Did you want to say something to us?
Yes.
Okay, your timing is perfect. So there'll be a public service announcement from our friendly representative.
Thank you. Sorry guys, so I'm from SONA. I'm one of the committee members. I'm not sure if you guys have all heard of what SONA is, but it's something that you don't know about. So basically it's just the student body for the institute, which as architects we'll all eventually be involved with. So we do have a few events coming up that you guys need to come to. So the first one is actually speed dating. That's going to be coming up in week 10. So, and before that, we also have portfolio. Sorry, I'm really out of my eyes picking up the stairs. Yeah, we have a portfolio kind of tutorial / bring it along and see your progress and get some feedback on it. And then after that, we have the speed dating event, which you should bring your portfolio to. And we're going to have, I would say, around 30 to 40 industry people there that you should get in front of and have conversations with about how you can get employed. A lot of the your students already have jobs in industry, so they're really good to interact with as well. So you guys should definitely feel like coming along to that too, because then you can talk to your students because they'll be like as well.
You might want to also introduce yourself and where you are in the course and how your colleagues can find you.
Yeah, so my name is Zika. I'm in third year, and I am part of the student committee, like I mentioned, but we have our Facebook page. That's the easiest way to get to all of us. One is actually the rest for Sona, and we're just like your henchmen. But you guys should definitely follow the Facebook page because all of the events will be posted there, so you can see all the details. And also in collaboration with our club, they have a lot of events that will help kind of fund third year's graduation studio, which you guys can take inspiration from because we'll be doing it anyway next year. So yeah, there's lots of events coming up from both clubs, so definitely get involved with them. We just had a 24-hour studio, which was really great. Some people came to see how that was, so I hope you guys do it again next year. We did have such publicity as we would like. Yeah, thank you, John.
Don't go away yet. Let me just, are there any questions? Well, I have a question, what's the speed dating thing about?
Okay, so basically it's a chance for students to interact with people in the industry and have kind of a dialogue about what they need to be hired. Also, because campus is quite a small knit group, it's easier to meet people in person and kind of make an impression that way rather than just kind of spamming people with your resume and portfolio online. So it's a good chance to just yeah, meet people face to face and have a good conversation.
So it's speed dating. It's using a speed dating methodology rather than trying to introduce you to someone that you might get romantic.
Yeah.
Okay, so yes, and that's really important because one of the things about how architects work or how architects get jobs is through the broader network of architects in a place. So the more you engage with that network through events such as this, the easier it is for you guys to go and find a job. Yeah. So and that network not only involves being involved with Solomon Institute student group, but also with your classmates above you, with the third years and so on and so forth. Because quite often what happens is that someone may well be looking for more, someone may be looking for more staff, and they'll just say to the students in the office, do you have any friends who would like to get a job? And then you know, one they go and tap with the shoulder of one of their classmates who they know can do the job, and then recommend them, and that's how it goes. For me, I have, when I was a practitioner, as a practitioner and as a student, I only formally applied for one job. The rest of it was all word of mouth. And even the job that I applied for, that was just a system. It was a friend of mine who worked in a firm who asked me to apply. And so out of the 9 jobs that I've had in offices, only one I actually applied for. And none of them I actually answered. I actually got from answering an ad, although I did apply to many firms. But really, it's that connection that's really important. And might I also say, Sika, the portfolio thing is really good too, because you can then bring your work to these things, and they can tell you what the kinds of things are important for them as employers, and to help you actually refine your portfolio. Because what you show us in the design studio is not necessarily what the architects want to see. Yeah. And just one final thing to go on with this network, the idea of the network, the idea of a collaborative space, and so on and so forth, is that all of you guys are responsible to each other, and eventually this will matter in terms of being responsible and helping each other later. So if you're in a group assignment now and you shaft the group members may well remember this, and at crucial times, it may come back to haunt you. Okay?
I'm sorry, Don, I forgot to say there's one more event.
Yes.
It's the speaker series at the National Gallery. So I'm not sure if you guys know about that, but it happens every year. And again, it's pretty early on in the semester. It started on the 5th of September, so Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock. And it's really a chance just to hear contemporary architects, Australian architects, and get some inspiration from their talks and what projects they're working on, and a lot of it will be relevant to studio as well. So,
national architects.
Yes, yeah. I definitely recommend. Oh yeah, there's one from Singapore coming.
International architects.
Yeah, so
originally from Australia.
Yeah, so there's some really cool projects coming up in that speaker series. So I definitely recommend if you're like wanting inspiration or just something to do on Wednesday evening, you should go. Buy some tickets and go. Discounts for students, obviously. So.
I think the takeaway for this, and thank you for coming in, Sika, is really that you know, you live within a community of architects, and the sooner you can engage with that community, the sooner you can reap dividends from it, or you know, get advantage out of it, because that's how the industry works. Okay, Sika, any last words?
No, that's it. Thank you guys. Sorry for my sudden appearance. I wasn't sure how to time it again.
Well, neither was I, so you're doing fine.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, let's break into our 2 groups. Those guys who are in Rob's afternoon group, Rob's group, please come back and see Melanie at 2:30.